Pride High, Book 1, Read. Written by J. Bell. Narrated by Talia Carver. Chapter 1. September 7th, 1992. A new start. That was how the beginning of the school year always felt. Anthony had been certain, when arriving at Pride High as a freshman, that he would be a changed person, deeper in thought and emotion as he partook of experiences forbidden to the young. Love, sex, and drugs. Instead, he had mostly stayed close to his best friend as they tried to survive being the lowest on the totem pole, and honestly, that had been pretty great too. Now he had a second chance, with the added benefit of experience. From the passenger side of his brother's truck, Anthony considered the school and wondered if being a sophomore would really make a difference. "Same deal as last year," Mike grumbled as he put the truck in park. "If anyone messes with you, I'll kill them. Otherwise, you're dead to me." Anthony fought down a grin and nodded. "Cool." He hopped out and slung a strap over one shoulder, letting the backpack hang loose on the other side. Mike slammed the truck door and glanced around the parking lot. He saw someone he recognized, raising one of his big paws in greeting. Then he shot a disdainful glare in Anthony's direction before strutting away. None of this was taken personally. His older brother was a good guy. Only rarely did he make Anthony's life a living hell. They simply inhabited two very different worlds. Despite their shared parentage and upbringing, none of that mattered here. High school was its own microcosm. The rules inside its walls were different from those of the real world. And that's exactly how Anthony thought of it. A weird alternate reality. A dream existence that he inhabited 5 days a week, 9 months a year. Maybe other people saw it differently. This might be where they felt the most alive. But for people like him, it was all an act. A farce that he willingly took part in. Because the alternative, telling everyone the big ugly truth, was unthinkable. He eyed the school while standing next to Mike's truck, giving his older brother the distance he demanded. The brick building was sprawled out at the edge of a middle-class neighborhood, a church and public pool across the street from the campus. Anthony took the opportunity to unzip the front of his backpack where he kept his Walkman and a selection of cassettes. He'd brought 6 options with him today, an unusual amount, but he wasn't sure which fix he would need. Something ethereal, to enhance the feeling of detachment? No, that would allow the outside world to break through too easily. He fingered a bootleg copy of 9 Inch Nails' debut album before deciding it was the perfect choice. He hit the eject button, popped the tape inside, and uncoiled the earbuds, one ringed with blue, the other red, that were the only surviving component of his old Game Boy. The rest was at the bottom of a pond. Not that he cared. He was more into music than gaming, and the earbuds were better than the cheap foam headphones the Walkman had originally come with. He thought of how distraught he had been after the Game Boy had slipped from his best friend's hand and sunk into the dark, murky water of a pond. The memory made him laugh. Good old Omar. Anthony took a step forward, filling with excitement at the thought of reuniting with him, which was dumb because they'd just hung out the night before, and for the entire summer. But somehow it still wasn't enough. They had too much fun together, which almost made the prospect of another school year appealing. Anthony only needed to go and find him. After making sure Mike was no longer around, he grabbed the passenger side mirror and pushed against it so he could see himself better. Black was the theme, starting with the short, tousled hair that he ran a hand through, just to mess it up even more. Everyone was under pressure from their parents to don their Sunday best. Anthony wore a black dress shirt that he'd unbuttoned on the drive over, revealing a plain white t-shirt, which contrasted with the black jeans and shoes. He loved dressing in monochrome, especially since he could already see tons of garish shirt patterns and stonewashed jeans. Those weren't an option for him. As much as Anthony tried to blend in, he still had to live with himself. Pushing the play button on his Walkman, he listened to the hiss of static, relieved when a clicking sound and drums built into a heavy industrial groove that made him feel powerful and otherworldly. He mouthed along to the nasal vocals, bobbed his head along with the beat until he reached the doors. The grin remained on his face in a way that he hoped appeared cool and confident. He didn't want to be mistaken for a freshman. He could already see a few of them sprawled out on the hard floor beyond the entrance doors. They must not have older siblings to warn them of the tradition. Freshmen were always tripped on their way in during the first day of school. A handful of exasperated teachers were running around, helping the fallen and scolding anyone behaving suspiciously, but they were outnumbered. Anthony had nothing to worry about. He was much taller this year, just under 6 feet. His brothers still towered over him, but Anthony was relieved to have finally hit any sort of growth spurt. Now, if only their beefy muscles would make an appearance. So far he had struggled to put on much weight. A foot jutted out just as Anthony crossed over the threshold. He not only saw it in time, but made a point of stepping directly on the shoe while glaring at the owner, who grimaced in pain. That made him feel good, especially since Omar hadn't been as lucky during his first year and had not only fallen, but landed on his chin, an awkward bruise marring his first week of school. Anthony still remembered wanting to find who had done it. That someone had messed with Omar had somehow been worse than if it had happened to himself. He was brought back to the present as a teacher with gray hair blocked his path. The man gestured at Anthony's earbuds while mouthing words, Trent Reznor's voice seeming to come out of him instead. The gist was clear. No listening to music in school. Anthony played dumb. He nodded, grinned, and said in an extra loud voice, "It's good to be back, yeah. I better get to class." The teacher scowled, but before he could try again, a small Asian kid barreled into the man from the side, having just suffered the first day tradition. The kid looked back and forth between them before rushing away. While the teacher was searching for the culprit, Anthony slipped past him and continued down the hall. Music was the ultimate shield. The scornful words of teachers couldn't touch him. Insults went unheard. Best of all, it turned the world around him into a music video. The swarms of students rushing to find their class almost felt like a mosh pit, or some sort of a bizarre, brightly lit nightclub. Not that Anthony had ever experienced such things in person, but it wasn't hard to imagine somewhere cooler than school, and his own personal soundtrack certainly helped. After turning down another hall, his heart skipped it. No. He simply felt happy to see his best friend waiting for him outside the classroom door. Omar hadn't escaped the obligation to dress up today. Tomorrow he would be back to wearing a heavy metal t-shirt. Today he wore a short-sleeved polo that stretched across his chest in a way that Anthony found distracting. He didn't have much in the way of chest muscles himself, so he envied the way that Omar had filled out over the summer. The jeans and skate shoes were predictably black, but he wore the color well. It paired naturally with his dark, sparkling eyes and waves of silky panther hair that draped over his ears and stopped just a few inches shy of his shoulders. The natural olive hue of Omar's skin kept him from appearing pale against so much contrast. The easy grin and strong nose conspired to make him handsome, if you could call another guy that. Anthony knew that he could, but he sure as hell didn't like to dwell on it. He watched Omar smile, give an upward nod, and raise his faithful camcorder to point it at Anthony. He fished out his earbuds just in time to hear Omar say, "There he is, ladies and gentlemen, a prince among men, destined this year to become the king. But not the lame kind at prom that nobody cares about. No, this absolute badass is going to rule these shitty halls with his sharp mind and good looks. And maybe some of those killer dance moves. Come on now, let's see 'em." No problem. While approaching him, Anthony began bobbing his head from left to right, letting the motion move down to his shoulders and through the rest of his body without attempting to appear cool. He only had one goal in mind while wiggling like an idiot, the dance becoming more exaggerated with each step. He was about to bump into the lens before Omar finally lowered the camcorder and started laughing. Mission accomplished. "Fucking A, dude," Omar said while wiping at his eyes. "Can you believe it? We're sophomores." "You make it sound like there's some kind of benefit," Anthony replied. "Do you think prisoners celebrate their second year behind bars?" "Good point. But they don't—" A shrill bell rang in the hall, cutting off whatever his friend was going to say. They rolled eyes at each other before walking into the classroom. Instead of individual desks, there were tables big enough to seat two. They found one that was unoccupied at the back of the room and claimed it, bumping elbows with each other in celebration. "This is already way cooler than last year," Omar enthused. "Instead of starting each day in separate math classes, we get to hang together in journalism. The way he stressed the course name made it sound like they'd won the lottery. This is going to be so easy, dude. Do you know what a newspaper is? Yep, Anthony confirmed. Boom, you get an A. Oh, wait, do you know what a yearbook is? Sure do. Nice, you've aced this class. Feel free to take a nap during the rest of the semester. Anthony laughed. He didn't think it would be as easy as that, but when debating which electives to choose, it hadn't taken long to convince Omar that this would be their best chance to hang out and have fun while in school. And, because there was only one such class per day, they were guaranteed to end up in the same room during the same period. And they had. They both seemed to recognize this fact at the same time and bumped elbows again. Hello, everyone. They turned their attention to the front, where a teacher leaned against his desk. He wore a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up and a pair of classic blue jeans. His silver hair was parted on one side and slicked back with styling product. All of this, combined with smiling gray eyes, gave him an approachable demeanor. Anthony hoped to hell he wasn't going to be one of those annoyingly inspirational teachers who told them to seize the day or whatever. My name is Mr. Finnegan, the man continued. I'm happy that you've chosen journalism as an elective. For the first semester, we'll be focusing on the school newspaper, but in the future, you'll also have the opportunity to contribute to the yearbook. And for the first time ever, we'll be using computers to lay out. A chiming noise from the PA system interrupted Mr. Finnegan, who sighed and turned his attention to the speaker in the ceiling. Welcome back, students, said a female voice. That would be Mrs. Preckwinkle, the school principal. She always sounded like she'd just gotten off the bus from Minnesota. We hope you're excited to begin another year at Pride High, home of the Roaring Lions. Let me begin by reminding everyone of the rules, starting with behavior in the hallway. There is to be no... Anthony rolled his eyes and popped his earbuds in, grinning at Omar when his friend heard the music playing. He took out the earbud on that side and offered it to him. Omar stuck it in his own ear without checking for wax. More proof that they were best buds. Mrs. Preckwinkle's voice was soon drowned out by industrial perfection. Anthony was nodding along to the beat when he noticed Mr. Finnegan watching him. He could swear the teacher smirked before returning his gaze to the ceiling. Maybe he'd turn out to be cool after all. Anthony kept the music going until Mr. Finnegan pushed himself away from his desk and glanced over at them. Anthony repaid his tolerance by hitting stop on the Walkman and yanking on the cord so the earbuds popped out. Okay, Mr. Finnegan said, sounding exasperated. With that out of the way, let's get to know each other. Everyone stand up for me, please. Grab your things and move to the back of the classroom. Oh, yeah. He was definitely going to be one of those Dead Poets Society teachers. By the end of class, they'd probably be passing a talking stick around while weeping about their deepest personal tragedies. Or maybe not. Anthony was puzzled and then disheartened as Mr. Finnegan began calling out their names and pointing to seat assignments. Anthony Cullen, Mr. Finnegan said, glancing around until their eyes met and he saw a nod. Do you go by Tony? Never. That's fine. Take a seat right there. One half of the table he gestured to was already occupied by Mindy Beaumont. Anthony looked over at Omar, who shrugged helplessly. So much for their plan to hang out together during first period. He forced down a grimace when taking his seat. He and Mindy went way back. She never let him forget how in 4th grade they had... My former fiancé, Mindy said as he plopped down. She was a skinny girl with a wavy bob of red hair and 2 rows of silver braces that she flashed at him. Looks like we'll be keeping our vows, till death do us part. For whatever reason, they had pretended to marry each other during recess years ago. Anthony had let himself get roped into playing house with the girls. Okay, he actually liked playing with them, and had ended up as Mindy's bride instead of her husband, which was the main reason he didn't like being reminded of it. She was okay, though. They didn't have much in common. Mindy was nice and also fun to talk to, but she wasn't... Omar Jafari? Yup, his best friend responded. Right over here, please, Mr. Finnegan instructed. The table was 1 row over and another back, meaning that Anthony wouldn't be able to see Omar unless he turned around. That sucked. All that remained was to see who his friend got stuck with. Tracy Lemont? Tracy? She's a no-show. Ralph Myers. Oh, wait, he had a change of schedule. Let's see. Anthony found himself holding his breath, which was weird. Why did it matter who Omar ended up with? Mr. Finnegan was much slower when pronouncing the next name. Riku Nishikawa? Everyone calls me Ricky, a voice said. Anthony craned his neck and saw the same Asian kid that had been tripped in the hall earlier. He was definitely a freshman, judging by how small he was. None of that mattered. What bothered him more was the tremendous sense of relief he felt. Anthony followed it down to the source and mentally recoiled when he discovered the reason. Omar hadn't been paired with a girl. Anthony was glad, but only because it was the sort of thing that could interfere with their friendship. I still have the ring you gave me, Mindy said. Remember when we walked to the grocery store after school and bought one from the quarter machines up front? How could I forget? Anthony joked. I'm still paying it off in installments. They caught up while Mr. Finnegan finished doling out seat assignments. Once he had, the teacher returned to the front of the class to begin his lecture. Let's dive right into what makes good reporting, starting with the 5 W's. Who can tell me what those are? Here's a hint, I just gave one of them away. The class continued in this manner. Anthony's strongest subject was English. Writing essays had never intimidated him. This shouldn't be much different. Okay, Mr. Finnegan said when glancing at the clock toward the end of the hour. That just about does it. I'm not going to give you homework on your first day of school, but I do want you to think about your next assignment. You'll be teaming up with the person that you're seated with. Confer with them and decide what kind of article you'd like to write. Normally, when working with a newspaper editor, you'd be given a specific subject to report on. Not this time. I'd like to know what you feel passionate about. Go ahead and begin discussing it with your partner. Has your number changed? Mindy asked. She turned an earnest expression on him, her pale skin dotted with freckles. I could call you tonight so we can discuss it. He didn't remember ever giving her his number, or talking to her on the phone, but that was okay. Sure. What should our topic be? The exploitation of child labor in modern journalism? To his surprise, she understood the root of his sarcasm. Mr. Finnegan is nice. I had him for English last year. He'll probably let you switch seats to be with Omar again. Wow, was he that transparent? We'll see, Anthony said. For now, we're writing this article together. What should it really be about? This made her smile. I was reading in National Geographic how women in third world countries spend hours each day walking back and forth to the nearest source of clean water, which prevents them from getting an education or making any real social progress. At least he was stuck with someone who had substance. That sounds perfect, Anthony said just before the bell rang. Give me a call and we'll figure out how to do this. Mindy had a spring in her step as she gathered up her things and left the room. Anthony lingered. That sucked, Omar said, coming over to join him. Yeah, Anthony murmured. I'm going to stick around and ask Mr. Finnegan if he'll let us team up. Good luck, Omar grumbled while looking elsewhere. Anthony followed his gaze just in time to see Ricky run into the doorframe with his shoulder, which was enough to spin him around. He saw them staring, smiled, and waved, before looking mortified and rushing from the room. See you at lunch? Anthony asked. Yeah. They bumped elbows without much enthusiasm before parting ways. The classroom was mostly empty now, so Anthony approached Mr. Finnegan, who was seated at his desk while writing something down. Excuse me, sir, Anthony said, cranking his manners up to 11. Do you have a moment, please? Certainly, Mr. Finnegan said, taking off a pair of reading glasses and setting them next to a notebook. What can I do for you? Shane, isn't it? Anthony, he said with a friendly expression to show it was okay. I wanted to ask if it would be possible to switch partners. Oh? Any particular reason? If only he'd thought to come up with one. But he hadn't, which only left the honest truth. When my best friend and I signed up for this class, we were hoping that we'd get to sit together. I promise we'll pay attention and work hard. We won't goof off, I swear. I see. Mr. Finnegan stood, putting them on the same height. If it makes you feel better, the seat assignments are only temporary. I'm not the best with names, and this will help me learn who everyone is. By the end of September, we can loosen those restrictions. An entire month? Ugh. Would it still be possible to work with Omar on future assignments? Is that the young man with the camcorder? Mr. Finnegan asked. Yeah. Is he interested in photography? He has a good eye, Anthony said vaguely, worried his answer would influence the outcome. And you seem to have an ear for music. Is that a passion of yours? Not really. I can't play anything, or sing. That's okay. You could still make a career writing about it. Anthony's eyebrows shot up. You mean like for Rolling Stone magazine? Mr. Finnegan's eyes twinkled. Or even the media section of the Kansas City Star. You can combine journalism with just about any interest you have. But here's the thing. While out in the field, you'll have to talk to people that you don't know. And when you're in the office, you might not be particularly fond of certain coworkers. Mastering interpersonal skills is just as important as learning to write a good article. I understand how inspiring it can be to team up with someone you like on a subject you both love. There's room for that here, too. But for now, I need you to step outside your comfort zone, okay? Anthony's treacherous head nodded of its own accord. Yeah, gotta get to my next class. Thanks. The battle was lost, although the war didn't sound so bad, especially if it led to the sort of career Mr. Finnegan had mentioned. When imagining his future, Anthony often pictured himself in a recording studio, safely behind the glass window where the mixing took place. The location had more appeal than the work itself. He'd be separate from the musicians, the distance ensuring that nobody got too close, because if they did, well, they might notice what he had tried so hard to keep hidden. He'd never considered working for a magazine or newspaper. That might be even better. Oh, he's not strange, people would say. He's a writer, an artist. Anthony glanced around the hallway, suddenly, worried the subject on his mind could be sensed somehow. That stupid little word. How could 3 letters fill him with such dread and terror? He wasn't completely helpless, though. Anthony exerted the mental effort it took to shove the topic as deep into his subconscious as it would go. Then he reached for his earbuds and turned the volume up loud enough to guarantee he couldn't hear it whispering back there, conjuring up fantasies he knew would never come true, no matter how much he really wanted them to. Chapter 2, September 7th, 1992. Who's it going to be? Omar was saying, while slowly panning his camcorder across the school cafeteria. Which one of these beautiful women is going to be the future Mrs. Jafari? There she is, David said, reaching up to stop the camera just as it pointed at the lunch ladies who were dishing out slop, one tray at a time. Hey, Omar said as he lowered himself back onto the bench. As long as they put out, I'm not turning anyone away. Even the lady with the twin moles? Dave asked. Who cares? Omar said with a shameless grin. I'm sick of being a virgin. He glowered suddenly at their 2 lunch companions. And don't pretend you're not, because we all are, right? He looked to Anthony, who nodded in solidarity. It was the truth, anyway. The other 2 guys started mumbling about how far they've gotten with girls, but didn't have the guts to claim they'd gone all the way. Dave and David. Anthony always had a difficult time telling them apart. They were both average height and build, with almost the same shade of brown, poofy hair. If one of them, David, wasn't trying so hard to sprout a mustache, they'd be nearly identical. Then again, when he looked at his own best friend, they too had a questionable amount of similarities, starting with their black hair. Anthony's was naturally blonde, although he hadn't dyed it to match Omar, whose hair was the real deal thanks to his heritage. And yeah, they both preferred to dress in black, but whatever. Maybe that came with the territory. The closer you got to someone, the more alike you became. Who have you got your eye on? Omar asked him. Mindy kept looking over at you during class. Mindy Beaumont? David asked. We used to date. Since when? Dave asked. We went to the dance together, remember? That was in junior high. The dynamic of their friendship was different. Dave and David tended to pick at each other. Anthony and Omar had each other's backs. That's how it had always been, going all the way back to the 1st grade, when Anthony had struggled to use a drinking fountain. Omar had come up and held the button down for him, grinning the entire time like they were already friends. They hadn't known each other yet. They'd been strangers in separate classrooms, but after meeting in the hall, they saw each other during recess and began playing together. They'd been inseparable ever since, rarely hanging out with anyone else outside of school. Anthony wouldn't mind it staying that way either. "What do you think?" Omar pressed, ignoring the other two. "Are you interested in Mindy?" "We're more like friends," Anthony answered lamely. "Who then?" Anthony searched the cafeteria for a girl they would consider so pretty that they'd never actually expect him to talk to her. "Angela Simmons," he said at last. "The cheerleader?" Dave said with a snort. "Good luck." "Hey," Omar said. "If Anthony says he's going after Angela, it's just a matter of time before she buckles." "Her boyfriend is a senior," David said, "and he's huge." "It's not the size that counts," Omar said. "Maybe you should keep your eyes to yourself in the locker room." "I didn't mean—" "So eager to deny it," Omar chuckled. "But for real, she's taken." "Then it's a waiting game," Anthony said with a shrug. He forced himself to ask the next question, not truly wanting an answer. "What about you?" "My new algebra teacher isn't bad," Omar said with a wicked grin that was endearing. "She's young, too. Probably not even 50 yet." "So wrong," Dave said, shaking his head. "Hey, me and David ended up in the same math class." "And the same English class," David added excitedly. "And it looks like we have 5th period together, too." Omar scowled at them before turning to Anthony. "I'm so jealous. We should have taken that business elective together." "Yeah, I know." Anthony had opted for psychology as his second elective. He spent so much time in his head these days that he thought it might help. With everything. "We still have journalism." "Even though we can't sit at the same table, or work together. Hey, what did Mr. Finnegan say?" Anthony shook his head. "No dice." "Crap," Omar said. "I'm stuck with a real weirdo, too." He leaned over and dug into his pocket. "Look how this kid Ricky wrote his phone number down. He was worried that I couldn't read it, so he wrote it down twice. But, he literally spelled out each number." Omar showed them a folded piece of paper. Beneath a string of digits were the same numbers, except as entire words. 9, 1, 3. "What the hell?" Dave said. "He even wrote out the dashes." "He's a freshman," Omar explained. The rest of them nodded as if this made sense. Anthony included. "I'll see you after school?" he asked as people began migrating toward the trash cans with their trays. "Yeah," Omar said. "I just hope your brother doesn't make us hide in shame again." "He won't," Anthony said. "I mean, at least we're not freshmen anymore." "I hate your brother," Omar murmured as he rolled his neck to work out the kinks. "Did he have to make us duck the entire way home?" "What'd you say?" Mike grumbled, stopping at the front door and turning around. "I was just thanking you for the ride," Omar said cheerfully. As soon as Mike's back was to them again, he stuck out his middle finger. Anthony laughed at this. At least the ride home was short. The high school wasn't far, just a 20-minute walk, which they sometimes took, but not when the weather was still so hot. 5 minutes of air-conditioned comfort, even when squatting on the floorboard or curled up on the seat, was better than their clothes sticking to their skin. And now that his oldest brother had moved away for college, they no longer had to deal with Mike once inside. Sharing a room with him all the way through junior high had not been fun. At least they had a house. His parents weren't rich, but they'd managed to get their own place when he was still young. Anthony remembered how excited he'd been to have his own yard for the first time. The 2-story house looked and felt a little 70s, but he couldn't imagine his entire family crammed into a small apartment, especially considering how big his brothers had grown up to be. "What do you think?" Anthony asked after they grabbed 2 cans of pop from the refrigerator. "Should we play some Mario Kart?" "Yeah," Omar said, following him up to his room. "Hey, can I borrow something to wear? I can't stand this anymore." Anthony turned around in time to see Omar stripping off the polo shirt. He caught a glimpse of the dark hair under his arms, which he'd spotted a few times during summer while swimming together, and when those arms came down again, the chest muscles reappeared. Anthony forced himself to tear his eyes away before Omar noticed. He turned around to prove how uninterested he was and went to the small closet, a poster of Robert Smith seeming to judge him for this behavior, before the door it hung on swung open. "I have a shirt of yours, actually," Anthony said. "Remember when you stayed the night and got pizza all over yourself?"
"Hey, the cheese slid off the crust," Omar said defensively. "Archie's always goes heavy on the sauce. That's why they're so good."
"Well, my mom washed your shirt, so here you go." Anthony tossed it to him. He was glad to get the t-shirt out of his closet, especially since it was Motley Crue themed. Strange, then, that he'd waited nearly a month to return it. "Trade ya," Omar said, tossing the polo to him. "You can keep that." "You looked good in it," Anthony said, quickly adding, "like you could wear it on a date."
"Yeah?"
Omar asked. "Give it back to me when it's washed, then. I want my mom to panic when I come home without it." Anthony laughed and averted his eyes while Omar pulled on the new shirt, his friend exhaling like he already felt better. He wasn't alone. Just being in this room again, as they so often were, made Anthony feel much more secure. He was surrounded by everything he cared about. The posters and torn-out magazine pages that featured the bands he liked, the pirate flag hanging above his headboard, a gift that Omar had brought back from a family vacation to the Caribbean, the wooden crate-style shelves that held all his cassette tapes, the stereo, Super Nintendo, small hand-me-down TV, and even the bed they sat on. All of these were reassuringly familiar. They did things outside, too, of course, but this was where most of their friendship took place, either here or at his best friend's house.
"It's good to be home,"
Omar said, expressing the same sentiment.
"Hey, before we start playing, I had an idea for another video."
"Uh-oh," Anthony said with a wry smile. He was expecting them to film another sketch. The most recent had involved him smearing toothpaste all over his cheeks to give himself a fake beard, so he could play an old man who was upset about the world not changing fast enough. It was a nice inversion of the usual stereotype. Omar had even found an excuse for the old man to yell, "Get on my lawn, you dang kids," so they could join him in a protest. He watched his best friend set the camcorder on the dresser next to the TV. His parents had a lot more money than Anthony's did, and they hadn't spared any expense when giving him the camcorder for his birthday last year. Omar had raved about it so much that Anthony still remembered the make and model. A Sony Hi8 Handycam something or other. He watched his friend plug the AV cables into the television, and, as so often before, what the lens saw appeared on the screen in black and white. Anthony didn't even squirm anymore, like he used to when faced with a living image of himself. Sure, he saw himself in the mirror all the time, but being on TV was different somehow.
"I thought we'd record a message,"
Omar said as he adjusted how the image was framed.
"Like a time capsule, except it'll be for us to watch at the end of the year."
"Great idea," Anthony said.
"Cool."
Omar plopped down next to him, their legs and shoulders touching so they'd both fit on the screen. His dark eyes sparkled as he looked over at Anthony with a smile. Filming things always made him happy. It could even get him out of a bad mood. "Hey, future Omar," he said when turning to face the camera. Anthony dutifully did the same. "How's it going, future self?"
"We hope you're still best friends," Omar continued. "If you're not, you fucked up and you better do everything you can to course correct."
Anthony wagged a finger at the lens.
"That's right. Stop fighting over which one of you is handsomest. Because obviously it's me."
Anthony thought so too, but he successfully resisted the urge to nod. Instead, he asked, "So, what have you guys been up to?"
"Good question," Omar said. "We'll tell you what we think you should have done by now. I want to finally shoot a short film. No more excuses, like how you're building up to it with the sketches. Write the script and get the damn thing done."
"Help him with that," Anthony said, already familiar with this dream. "And start going to concerts. I don't care if you have to sneak out. You're turning 16 soon. It's embarrassing that the only live music you've seen is at weddings."
"Or the marching band at school," Omar interjected.
"Exactly. 20 years from now, you'll be crying that you never got to see Morrissey while he was still alive.
Or even if he is, wheelchairs are a mood killer, Omar said. At least on stage when everyone is trying to rock out. My grandma is cool, though. Oh, fuck. I hope she's still alive next year. Let's not go there, Anthony said. No, definitely not. You better help him get to those concerts, future Omar. And speaking of stuff that you haven't done yet, sex, Anthony said. We expect to be rolling in it. He thought his friend would back this demand with enthusiasm, but was surprised at how somber his response was. Or at least go on a date, you know, Omar said dejectedly. With someone who actually likes you back. We've both had girlfriends before, Anthony said, wanting to build him up. Yeah, but that was in junior high, when we didn't have a clue. I want a real connection. I guess it doesn't have to happen in high school, but man, I sure want it to. Same here, Anthony said while staring at him. He caught himself, swallowed, and turned to the camera. But we both know it's not going to happen. Come on now, Omar said with a nudge. We're not completely hopeless. That wasn't what he meant, and he sure as hell didn't want to clarify, so he turned it into a joke. We'll start saving up now just in case we need to pull a risky business. Hire a super hot prostitute who looks like an elf? Omar's nod picked up speed. Yeah, if you haven't gotten anywhere by the time we watched this video, break that piggy bank and get yourself some honey for money. This made them both laugh. They kept filming, making predictions about what the future would be like, before Omar grumbled that the battery was about to die. They switched to playing video games until close to dinner time. I better get home, Omar said. That weird kid wants me to call him tonight. You better be willing to do an article on killer robots. What are you and Mindy writing about? Water, Omar grimaced. Wow, that plan of ours sure worked out great. They bumped elbows before parting. There wasn't any need to see him out. Omar was basically part of the family. That's how Anthony was treated at his place, too. He did listen for the front door, though, and once he heard it shut, he went to where the polo shirt had been left on the bed. Anthony carefully folded it and placed it beneath his pillow, refusing to let himself think about the reason why. He already knew he'd pretend to forget about it. And once he had rested his head on the pillow and took in Omar's familiar scent, he'd tell himself he was too tired to put it somewhere else. Just like he'd done with the Motley Crue t-shirt. I know what I am. Anthony was supposed to be writing down ideas for the article that he was working on with Mindy. When talking on the phone after dinner, they'd agreed it would be plagiarism to use a single article as their only source. They'd decided to include how their own lives would have been different if women in Kansas had to haul water home each day, on foot. His mother had always worked full-time as a hairstylist, as far as he could remember, so his family would have had less money. They probably never would have gotten the house. He could think of other consequences, but his thoughts kept being invaded by the events of the day, and all he'd managed to scribble down were words that cut to his core with a jagged blade. I know what I am. Everything had been so much easier over the summer. When it was just him and Omar, Anthony could almost forget that he didn't fit in, that he constantly found himself watching others so he could emulate their behavior. Guys were supposed to obsess over girls and do everything possible to get their attention, except that didn't come up as much when they were alone. They joked and talked about sex all the time, endlessly fascinated with the subject, but the tone was different. At school, even his best friend tended to brag and boast more, despite neither of them having managed to do anything aside from speculate and hope. When it was only them together, he thought again of how vulnerable Omar had seemed when talking about dating. I want a real connection, with someone who actually likes you back. That bugged Anthony, because they had that already. Not in the romantic sense, they were only friends. But how much better could it get? Every minute spent together was perfection, and apparently that wasn't enough. Omar wanted more, but then, if Anthony was honest with himself, he wanted more too. I know what I am. He stared at these words, his breath short when he brought the pen close to the paper again. After a moment of hesitation, he hastily added, I'm gay. Anthony inhaled, his pulse racing, with fear, excitement, He'd reached the same conclusion before, after years of it being a long, drawn-out suspicion. Anthony could still remember a particular recess during the 6th grade, back when hanging out with a group of guys meant trying to impress each other with whatever scraps of adult knowledge they'd managed to piece together. One of them had finally put a title on it for him, what it actually meant to be gay, the real meaning behind the insult. Much like the term bastard, there was a technicality that made someone qualify. Anthony had experienced a terrifying thrill when hearing another boy describe it. He wasn't a bastard, no, but he was a fag. Little had changed since then. He remained both fearful of and strangely drawn to the thought of being with another guy. And he was almost okay with that until he thought about how the rest of the world would react, how the people in his life would turn their backs in disgust, even his best friend. Anthony returned the tip of the pen to that dangerous little word so he could scribble it out, worried that someone might be able to decipher it anyway. He didn't stop until the pen had worn a hole through the paper. Even then, he tore the remainder into shreds that were buried at the very bottom of his trash can. Anthony knew what he was. That was no revelation. But he also knew what he'd have to pretend to be if he wanted people to keep loving him. Chapter 3. September 8th, 1992. Omar waited outside the journalism classroom, his camcorder safely stowed in his locker. He didn't carry it with him everywhere, mostly because people found it insufferable. But on the first day of school, he didn't regret documenting that moment in history, despite it not living up to his fantasies, although there had been a glimmer of hope toward the end. When he saw his best friend coming down the hall, Omar wished he did have his camcorder, because Anthony always looked so damn cool. Sort of like John Cusack, but not from Say Anything when he stood around with a dumb boombox over his head, more like Better Off Dead when he fixed up that badass Camaro with the sexy French girl. Anthony was wearing a black t-shirt that was all torn up, and another beneath it, blood red, that showed through, like someone had slashed him with a knife on the way to school. His hair was short on the sides and messy on top, which was probably an attempt to copy Morrissey. Anthony was into some weird music, but Omar liked that about him. The man had style, taste, and he was freaking smart. That's why it sunk they weren't allowed to work together for this class. Omar needed the boost it would have given his grades. "Day 2, he said when they were close enough to hear each other over the chaos in the hall. "Did your brother make you hide on the way here?" "Only when we got close to the school," Anthony replied, rolling his eyes. "He's worse when you're with me, for some reason." "Well, he can shove it, because I don't need a ride today." "You don't?" "No, I have to meet—" Omar glanced around and lowered his voice. "I have to meet Ricky after school to work on that paper." Anthony winced in sympathy. "Want to hang out after?" "I don't think I'll have time. I'm hoping we can get it all done in one go. But if you miss me too much, you could always call." They both stared at each other before cracking up. Guys didn't talk on the phone. Not to each other. Now, if there was a girl on the other end of the line, that changed everything. "Hey," Omar said, "I forgot to tell you. Remember that hot chick who works at the record shop you like? The one downtown?" Anthony's brow furrowed before he shook his head. "You mean at Right Round Records?" "Yeah, you know who I'm talking about?" "I guess." "What do you mean, you guess?" Omar demanded. Anthony shrugged. "I've chatted with the owner a little. A guy with huge, hairy arms that were always on display because he only wore sleeveless shirts, even in the dead of winter. Anthony remembered him, but not the pretty girl who— "Hi, guys," said a new voice. Mindy Beaumont. Back in the 2nd grade, Omar had gotten in trouble for putting gum in her hair. He wondered if she still remembered that. "Hey," his best friend said. "I'll meet you inside. We're just catching up." She clutched her books closer to her body, as if mentally hugging Anthony. "Okay." Her attention flitted over to him. "Omar," she said tersely. Oh, yeah. She definitely remembered. "Hey, how's it going?" he replied in his best bedroom voice. Mindy looked repulsed before pushing past him on her way into the classroom. "Want to switch partners?" Omar asked. "Me and her have real chemistry together." Anthony laughed. "No thanks." The bell rang, causing them both to groan. They bumped elbows without much enthusiasm and trudged into the classroom. "Welcome back, gentlemen," Mr. Finnegan said. "Hey," Omar replied, heading for his table. The weird kid, Ricky, was already sitting there. His eyes kept darting to him and away again, as if he couldn't work up the courage to make eye contact. Omar remembered how big and intimidating all the upperclassmen had seemed when he started high school. He puffed up his chest to make himself look buffer, and sure enough, the kid's eyes opened wider. "Hi, Omar," Ricky said, sounding just as breathless as on the phone last night. "Do you want to meet in the library during lunch to do research?" "No." Omar sat and kept his attention focused elsewhere. What a question. It was bad enough that they had to meet after school to work on a stupid paper. He wasn't giving up his only break to do even more studying. "Okay," Mr. Finnegan said. "I mentioned yesterday that when working for a newspaper, the editor will often assign a specific topic for you to report on, but it's also possible that they'll ask you to pitch them an idea. So let's go table to table and hear what everyone decided to write about. Really try to sell it to me, as if you're unsure if I'll grant permission, because here's the thing. I might not." Omar straightened up with a jolt. Then he leaned to his right to get Ricky's attention. "I'll let you do the talking," he said with a wink. "Really sell him on those killer robots, okay?" Ricky nodded eagerly. Or he nodded in fear. Either way, Omar let himself relax again, already thinking about sixth period and everything he wanted to do when the school day came to an end. Omar's heart was thudding with excitement as he rushed to his locker, spun the combination lock, and took out two of his greatest treasures, his skateboard and his camcorder. He was always eager to escape this place, but rarely as much as today. If he didn't blow it this time, who knew what could happen? Instead of shoving the camcorder into his backpack, he put his head through the strap, letting it lay across his chest like an ammunition belt, the camcorder resting against his hip. Then he did his best to leave as quickly as he could, but kept running into people he hadn't seen since last year. He made it outside, eventually. Despite how much of a hurry he was in, he paused and let the sun warm his skin. It was a beautiful fucking day. The school was always freezing inside, even more so in the summer, since they really cranked up the AC. Once he no longer felt like he'd just checked out of a morgue, Omar gleefully leapt down a set of stairs, dropped his board on the sidewalk, and stepped onto it. Soon he was gliding away from the school. He let himself bask in how free this made him feel before he slung his camcorder around on its strap and balanced it on his shoulder to film some B-roll. He didn't have a particular need for the footage. Maybe he would use it to represent some disembodied spirit, flying through the town in search of its next victim, like Sam Raimi did in the Evil Dead movies. Although it was too nice a day for that sort of thing, in any case, maybe he'd want to look back on the footage when feeling homesick, assuming he went to an out-of-state university like Anthony's older brother had, and that seemed likely. All the good film schools were on the coasts, places like California and New York. Although, as crazy as it sounded, he wasn't eager to get away from this town. Omar had spent his entire life in Pride, and never felt much urge to leave. He liked it too much. Everything he'd ever wanted was already here and conveniently easy to reach. He left the residential neighborhood behind and cruised down the main road that ran through town. He passed a few of the big retail chains that were found in every American city, McDonald's and Walgreens, that sort of thing. Mostly, though, the people of Pride preferred to shop locally at businesses owned by their neighbors. The mayor had run a big campaign about that when Omar was a kid, which his father had talked about endlessly at the dinner table, since he owned the only prescription eyewear store in town, and intended to keep it that way. So far, he'd managed to. Even if his family didn't benefit from such a thing, Omar still would have supported the cause. Everywhere else in Kansas looked kind of the same. Maybe not the plaza in the downtown area, but all the suburbs outside of Kansas City had the same dumb stores and restaurants. As he cruised into the heart of Pride, Omar saw a number of specialty shops and cafes, most of which he associated with various families in town. He turned down Main Street, the 2-story brick buildings filling each block without a space between them. They matched the brick streets that forced traffic to slow, making it easier for pedestrians to cross wherever they needed to. He stuck to the smooth pavement of the sidewalk for as long as he could, until dodging shoppers became too tedious. Then he switched to his feet. He slowed even more when nearing Right Round Records. A pink 10-speed bike was parked out front, chained to one of the old parking meters which no longer functioned. The bike could belong to anyone, but man did he hope it hadn't been there long. He was tempted to touch the handlebars to see if they were still warm and sweaty, before deciding that was too creepy. Instead, he kept walking so he could check his reflection in the window of a florist. After making sure his hair wasn't too windblown, he circled back around to the record store. He looked in that window, too, as if unsure he wanted to shop there. He even tried to appear interested in one of the albums he saw, pretending it was his motivation for opening the door and going inside. He maintained his cool disposition by not glancing at the counter. He simply browsed the nearest row of records. Time seemed to crawl by, and when he finally let himself check the counter to see who was working there, he was rewarded with a bald dome surrounded by a ring of straggly gray hair. Not exactly the vision of desire he'd been expecting. The customer was an older dude who was blocking his view. When the man finished buying whatever he'd come here for and walked away, there she was. Omar had just seen her half an hour ago at most, wearing the same lavender shirt tucked into pale blue jeans. She was still messing with the cash register and didn't notice him. That was fine. He hoped she hadn't witnessed the dumb window shopping performance he'd put on outside. Instead, he resumed browsing and noticed with abhorrence that he was in the country music section. That's what he got for not paying attention. Omar moved deeper into the store to the alternative section that Anthony could spend a literal hour browsing without getting bored. His best friend had once gone through it alphabetically. Omar didn't have that much time to spare, but he decided to do the same, so he wouldn't run out of excuses for being there. The only other customer finally left. Omar's palms began to sweat. What was he supposed to do now? How did he strike up a conversation with a girl that pretty? "Can I help you find something?" Oh, Jesus, it sounded like she was standing right behind him. Omar spun around and, yeah, she was close. A good 6 feet away, but still. It was near enough for him to take in the long, dark hair that spilled over her shoulders and down her back. She had glistening russet lips, a cute button nose, and big brown eyes that awaited his response. He was getting serious Jennifer Connelly vibes, like how she looked in Labyrinth, but even better because her skin was darker and, oh fuck, why was she getting adorable crinkles between those gently arching eyebrows of hers? She had asked something, but it seemed like a million years ago already. What was the question? "Hey, aren't you in the same class as me? 6th period, right?" "Business finances?" he said as if uncertain. "Yeah, I think so. His brain struggled to recall the one piece of information he should never forget. "Omar," he finished at last. "How funny," she said with a smile. "If I'd known you were coming here, I could have given you a ride on my bike." "I would have loved that," he said, not kidding in the slightest. She laughed like he was being funny, and he instantly retconned his memory to make the joke intentional. "Although it looks like you have your own wheels," she said. "That's yours over by the door, isn't it? If not, the old guy who just left is in for a long walk." He glanced over at where he'd propped up the skateboard once inside. "No, that's his all right," Omar lied. "He nearly knocked me off the sidewalk on my way here." She narrowed her eyes in suspicion before laughing again. That was a good sign, right? "I'm Silvia," she said, looking him over, her attention pausing on his chest. Omar inhaled as casually as possible to make it swell. "Metallica, huh?" she asked. He was momentarily confused until he glanced down at the shirt he was wearing. "Oh, right. I have a thing for skulls and lightning. What can I say?" "But you like listening to them?" Silvia asked. He wasn't sure if she'd think that was cool or not, so he hedged his bets. "Yeah, but the new album is kind of lame, especially the ballads." "Those are the only songs of theirs I like," Silvia replied. "Shit." He leaned forward, and in a conspiring whisper, he said, "Me too, but guys aren't supposed to cry, so..." Silvia seemed to find this amusing. "What else do you listen to?" Anthony was always pushing him to expand his musical horizons and listen to bands that had a message, like Queensryche, he blurted out. Her perfectly sculpted eyebrows shot up in response. Oh, I really liked that concept album they put out a few years back. What was it called?
Jackpot. He actually knew the answer.
Operation Mindcrime, he sang in a high-pitched imitation of the lead singer. Yes, Silvia laughed again. That album is hot. I'm going to listen to it tonight.
I will too, he said before he could stop himself. She didn't seem to mind.
If you like them, she said, walking past him down the aisle. A whiff of perfume hit him a split second later and nearly brought him to his knees. He managed to keep his feet long enough to follow her. Have you ever heard of Dream Theater? She asked.
No. Are they any good? She grabbed a CD and started removing the shrink wrap.
Give them a listen and decide for yourself.
Silvia walked back to the counter, her back to him as she messed with a stereo. Her hips were wide, her butt ballooning toward the bottom, which made his jeans feel tight. He swallowed and forced himself to focus on other details, like the plastic wrap that was drifting to the floor. Most of the stuff here was used, but you can just open whatever you want? He asked.
Yep, she said happily. Best perk of the job. I get to listen to anything here.
Silvia was smiling when she turned around. He was doing good. A guitar twanged from the store speakers, followed by drums and synth. He was thinking the music wasn't his style before some serious grinding riffs broke up the pleasant melody. When the lead singer finally started belting out lyrics, he could see why she associated the band with Queensryche. And man, did the song pick up speed just before the chorus. Omar bit down on his bottom lip and started banging his head. Not enough to make his hair a mess, but enough to show her that he was into the beat.
They've some nice ballads, too, she said, switching tracks.
Soon they were listening to a moody piano and the emotional kind of vocals that Anthony often preferred. I can't do this in public, Omar said, shaking his head. I have to be somewhere private to hide my shameful tears. That made her giggle. He was on fire. But the clock was ticking. He could see it above her head, the stupid thing reminding him that he was supposed to meet Ricky soon. I gotta run, he said, forcing the words from his mouth. Do you have this on cassette?
Yeah.
As she rang it up, her eyes kept darting over to him before she said,
Supongo que no eres mexicano?
He didn't understand what she meant, only that it was Spanish, which he was terrible at. No comprehendo, he managed.
Oh,
she looked embarrassed.
It's nothing.
Now you have to tell me, he said. She blushed before replying.
I was wondering if you're Mexican.
He got asked that a lot because of his darker skin tone and hair. No, I'm Persian, actually.
Oh, so your family comes from Iran?
Most people didn't connect the dots like that. They heard Persian and thought of exotic princes from Arabian Nights long ago or whatever. If he said he was Iranian instead, the Ayatollah and terrorism sprung to mind. He had learned that the hard way back in junior high when his folks went to a parent-teacher conference. His mother had worn a hijab, as she often did when dressing up for formal occasions. She always looked pretty as hell. But somehow news of this had gotten around the school, like the very next day, and that's when the other kids started teasing Omar and calling him names. The worst part is that he wasn't sure how anyone found out. Did one of his teachers say something? He didn't know who to trust after that. Aside from Anthony, who had never given him shit about his heritage. Yeah, Omar said tersely. My grandparents moved here from Iran.
Cool, she said. My parents are immigrants.
That made him feel less vulnerable. Oh, yeah? From where? She studied him before responding.
Mexico. It's nice you didn't assume, like I did.
Hey, us immigrant kids have to stick together, especially in white bread Kansas, am I right? She laughed and handed the cassette to him.
Be sure to let me know what you think of the album.
I will, he replied. Count on it. He was on cloud 9 as he left the store, so caught up in the euphoria that he forgot his skateboard. When he popped back in to get it, he said, Mind if I borrow this? I'm going to be late otherwise.
I'll tell the original owner that I never saw it,
Silvia replied. He smiled at her before leaving, and when she returned the gesture, he decided his love life wasn't as hopeless as he'd feared. Chapter 4, September 8th, 1992. Omar skated in a daze. his foot kicking on occasion to help him pick up speed. A lifetime of memories and associations allowed him to navigate on automatic, the active part of his brain preoccupied with thoughts of Silvia. Talking to her had felt good, almost as easy as when he hung out with Anthony. He thought of a million questions he should have asked, or funny responses he wished had occurred to him at the time. He was tempted to turn around and go right back to the record store, no matter how desperate that made him appear. If he didn't have the stupid paper to write with Ricky, maybe he would have. Omar slowed, becoming aware of his surroundings. The small downtown area of Pride was lined with old houses. His mother once referred to them as Victorian. He didn't know if that was accurate, only that the wooden homes had an excess of ornate details, most of them with a covered porch and a tower off to one side. He'd grown up in such a home, and, while it was nice, sometimes he preferred the look of the more modern neighborhoods, like he was heading into now. The leaves above his head rustled as he glided beneath the trees, their shade helping to cool him as he occasionally glanced up at a street sign, mostly out of habit. He could probably name the next 10 streets ahead of him and not get one wrong. He only slowed to double-check the address that he'd written down last night while on the phone with Ricky. They had talked about potential ideas for their article, Omar insisting on killer robots. Then he reviewed the footage he'd recorded earlier while half listening to Ricky rattle off a bunch of ideas. When the kid had finally run out of wind, Omar had said, "Killer robots it is." The 2-story house he stopped in front of was low-key in a way that appealed to him. Just a shoebox sitting on its smallest side with a pointed roof. The house itself was muted blue with faded maroon trim. The bushes and trees that clustered close made it appear cozy or mysterious. Anyone could live there, even a serial killer. Omar made 2 right angles with his thumbs and index fingers and used them to frame the shot. He loved location scouting. It always got his imagination going. The effect was ruined when he noticed the small Asian kid sitting on the front stoop while staring at him with eager eyes. The shorts and t-shirt he wore revealed skinny toothpick limbs. Omar gave an upward nod. He kicked on the tail end of his board, popping it up so he could grab the edge and carry it across the neatly trimmed grass. "What's going on?" he asked. "Did you get locked out or something?" Ricky stared a moment longer before shaking his head. "I was waiting for you." Outside? So uncool. Unless his folks were a nightmare to be around. There were times when Omar would rather stay outside the entire day, no matter how bad the weather, just to avoid his family, and he actually liked them. He was surprised then, as Ricky led him inside to a cool, dark interior, at just how silent the house was. "Anybody home?" Omar asked, leaving his skateboard next to the front door. "No, my parents don't get home until later." "Nice. Can I get something to drink? I'm parched." Ricky led him to the living room and left him there. Omar walked around the perimeter instead of sitting, noticing the family photos above the fireplace. In most of them, Ricky was smiling from between 2 adults who must be his parents. They were all wearing skiing gear in one. A family vacation, maybe? He turned to consider the living room, which was tidy and humble, like they cared more about comfort than impressing guests. Omar unslung his camcorder and set it on the coffee table before plopping down in a love seat so he wouldn't have to sit next to a lowly freshman. His plan worked. Ricky chose the perpendicular couch after setting down 2 glasses of orange juice. An odd choice, but Omar wasn't picky. He grabbed his and drank half of it down in a few gulps. Ricky only managed a few sips, his dark eyes lingering on Omar before he bounced back up again. "I got something today," he said while rushing back to the kitchen. "Was it a gold star on your spelling test?" Omar said quietly to amuse himself. "Or maybe a new stuffed animal?" "Huh?" Ricky asked on his way back. "Nothing," Omar said easily. "What's that?" Ricky set down a small stack of magazines. "I went by the library during lunch, like we talked about, and found these. I think they'll help with the paper." Omar leaned forward and saw they were all issues of Popular Science. The topmost featured a hokey-looking robot on the cover, the kind sold in Sears catalogs that carried a tray and didn't do much else, aside from being a useless remote-controlled vehicle. He shook his head in response. "Let's go to Blockbuster Radio and rent some movies about evil robots. Have you ever seen Westworld? Or how about Blade Runner? Or hell, even Chopping Mall would do." Ricky's eyes glittered at him curiously from beneath a mop of dark hair, his mouth opening and closing a few times.
I don't think Finnegan would accept those movies as valid sources. And besides, the replicants in Blade Runner aren't robots.
Sure they are.
Ricky shook his head. They aren't made of metal parts. They're organic.
Omar made a face. Why should that matter? They're still built or whatever, right?
Ricky shrugged. I think that's the point of the movie. We hate anything that's different, even when we can't tell it apart from us.
Omar blinked in surprise. Hey, that's not bad. Think we can use it in our paper?
After a bashful smile, Ricky said, Maybe. I did find an article that talks about why people get freaked out by them, even going way back. It had an image from an old black and white movie with a female robot.
Omar snorted. How could you tell it was a girl?
It had boobs, Ricky said with a titter.
Omar snapped his fingers.
That's gotta be Metropolis. I've always wanted to see it. I think it was in this issue, Ricky said, holding the magazine at arm's length while squinting.
He only brought it close to turn the page. Then he held it out again.
No, maybe it was in the other one?
Omar watched him struggle, remembering how in journalism class, Ricky practically had his forehead against the table when taking notes. It was the same when he struggled to write his number down. Don't shoot the messenger, my man, but you need glasses.
Ricky went rigid. Why do you say that?
Because you're holding the magazine like you're scared it'll bite you. I think you're farsighted. His face flushed in response.
I'm fine.
You're really not. Believe me, my dad owns Jafari Eyes.
Ricky shook his head. What's that?
Jafari Eyes? The eyewear place? You've never heard of it?
Ricky shook his head in somber ignorance.
Omar sighed and reached for his backpack. Okay, look, don't tell anyone I gave this to you. My dad makes me carry them around. He seriously expects me to give my friends a sales pitch. That's not what I'm doing, though. I think you really need this. He took out a business card and handed it over. Ricky brought it close to his face, clearly pretending to read.
Okay, thanks.
Is that the card with the right address? What's it say? Omar snorted. It's on the corner of Main Street and Henderson.
Where's that?
Ricky asked. Across the street from the public library? Next to the steaming stack?
Huh?
The breakfast cafe. Man, you gotta get out more. Ricky looked a little wounded.
There's a lot I haven't seen yet. We just moved here.
Oh. That made sense. Come to think of it, Omar didn't recognize him. He didn't know everyone he went to school with, of course, but most of the faces were familiar to some degree. Where from?
Colorado Springs.
Colorado? As in the state?
You've never heard of it? Ricky said with another glimmer in his eyes. You've got to get out more.
Touché, Omar said with a chuckle.
And for the record, Ricky continued, I already have glasses.
Then why don't you wear them? A sigh preceded his answer.
I don't want to look like a nerd.
Too late, Omar joked. I don't know if you can see me clearly, but I said that with a wink. And frankly, dude, you look weird squinting and bumping into everything.
Go get them.
Ricky hesitated. I won't make fun of you, Omar said. I swear. Hell, I'll give you an honest opinion. How's that? Practically an expert.
You don't wear glasses, Ricky challenged.
No, but my dad is an optician and my mom is an optometrist. This sort of thing is in my blood. Ricky eyed him warily before rising and leaving the room. When he came back, he had on a pair of black-rimmed glasses that pushed the hair away from his eyes, which had to help. Even at a casual glance, it was obvious he required a strong prescription. You've got nothing to worry about, Omar said.
They make my eyes huge.
Not huge, just bigger. It's not a bad thing. You have nice eyes. Now people can see them clearer. And you can actually see. Ricky stared at him, as if unsure what to say. If you really hate them, Omar said, you can get contact lenses.
I tried once. I couldn't get them in, and when I did, it hurt.
You get used to it. Ricky made a face.
How would you know?
It's the family business, Omar said, clearing his throat. He wasn't about to trot out his own shortcomings, even to make someone feel better. You look good. That's all that matters. Ricky seemed a little too pleased with this. He couldn't stop smiling as he sat again, even though it seemed like he was trying. He focused on flipping through the magazines and soon handed one to Omar.
There, is that the movie you were thinking about?
And the boobs, yes, Omar confirmed. Metropolis was one of the first full-length science fiction movies ever, way back when there wasn't even sound yet. The robot herself was kind of hot, but not when compared to a real girl. He thought of Silvia and how perfect her boobs were by comparison. Not too big and not too small. Although he wasn't picky, access to any boobs at all would have made him exceedingly happy. They set to work on outlining the paper, but it was too hard to concentrate with thoughts of Silvia filling his mind, which was crazy considering how little he had to go on. So far, he'd stared at the back of her head for 2 days in class and had a short conversation with her at a store, although that was already enough to fantasize about what else could happen. Not just the sexual stuff, but how cool it would be to have a girlfriend. He imagined them walking down the hall together and how jealous the other guys would get.
There are bomb disposal robots already, Ricky was saying. And they use robots at factories, too, like when assembling cars.
Yeah, but I wanted to write about killer robots.
That would be fun, Ricky said diplomatically. But they can't even walk yet.
Huh?
I just told you about that. Engineers can't get robots to balance on 2 legs, remember?
Okay, but they could have tank treads instead, like the one from Short Circuit.
I read something about that,
Ricky said, grabbing another book. While his study partner flipped through the pages, Omar let his mind wander back to his favorite subject. When that wasn't enough, he decided to talk about it. Right before I came over here, he said in a dreamy haze, I was hanging out with this gorgeous girl who's in my 6th period class. Silvia Diaz. Ever heard of her? I guess not. Believe me when I say that she's... He trailed off and shook his head, unable to find the words.
Is that your girlfriend? Ricky asked.
No, God, I wish. We've barely talked, but I swear we have this connection, you know? Ricky, to his surprise, nodded instantly.
Yes.
Omar found this intimidating. Don't tell me you're dating someone. Not that you couldn't, but most freshmen aren't that lucky.
I'm single, Ricky confirmed.
That was a relief. Omar felt lame sometimes for not having much experience with girls. Learning that awkward Ricky was ahead of him in the game of love would have been seriously demoralizing.
Are you going to sleep with her?
The question caught him off guard.
We just met, but I mean, if she's interested, then yeah. Well, Ricky replied, if you get that far, just remember to play with her clit.
Omar's mouth fell open.
What? Her clit,
Ricky said, unabashed.
That's short for clitoris, which is a little area on her.
I know what it is, Omar grumbled. I only wonder how you do.
My mom is a gynecologist,
Ricky said with a shrug.
Oh, and I've seen lots of porn.
Magazines? Omar asked, like the coveted copies of Playboy or Hustler, stolen from parents or older brothers and hidden away, to be shared with only the most trusted of friends.
Some, Ricky said with a nod, but I like the movies better.
Yeah, right. This had to be an attempt to impress him by sounding more mature than he really was. Let me guess, you rode on a friend's shoulders while wearing a trench coat and snuck into a dirty movie? Ricky laughed.
No, my parents have a small collection.
A collection? That was some claim. Like casually mentioning a bag of diamonds used as a paperweight. If nudie magazines were rare, actual pornos were legendary treasure. Aside from adult cinemas, which Pride certainly didn't have, such movies could only be rented or bought by adults. There was no other way to see them. At all. Unless your parents happened to own a few. What are we talking here? Omar said with guarded interest. VHS tapes? Ricky nodded.
Yeah.
Can I borrow one?
No way. I'd get in so much trouble if my parents found out.
Omar studied him before snorting. You're full of it.
I would.
No, I mean, I don't believe your parents have pornos. I bet you've never even seen one. Ricky jutted out his chin defiantly.
I'll prove it.
Good old reverse psychology. Omar's mouth was dry as he stood and followed Ricky through the house. He felt weird about being in the bedroom they entered, and downright uncomfortable when standing in a walk-in closet filled with starchy suits, way too many dresses, and stiff leather shoes. Adult clothes. The subtle scent of the house was more concentrated here, making him feel like he was invading the personal space of complete strangers. Which, of course, he was.
Ricky shoved some of the hanging clothes down the rack, revealing a department store shopping bag on the floor. He carefully set aside 2 folded sweaters that hid the true contents of the bag. Omar didn't ask how Ricky knew it was there. He'd already snooped through absolutely everything in his own home. "They have 6 different movies," Ricky was saying. "This one is about naughty nurses. It's pretty good. Or there's this one." "Perfect," Omar snapped. His pulse had picked up, both in anticipation and fear. "When do your parents get home? Another hour or so?" "Great, let's watch one." Ricky shrugged and brought the tape to the bedroom. His parents had a decent-sized TV across from their bed. Ricky turned this on, fed the tape into the player, and grabbed a remote. Omar sat on the end of the mattress. His attention was locked onto the screen, which after a whirring of gears, jumped and became an image of a nude man and woman lying in bed together. This scene faded, implying the tape hadn't been rewound. The glimpse of naked flesh already had Omar on high alert. He was about to see people having actual sex. The next scene began, revealing the interior of some random house, the front door in particular. The doorbell rang, a blonde woman bounding toward it. She had on the sort of workout clothes people wore in the 80s, her hair a massive perm, but he didn't linger on such details for long, only the cut-off t-shirt and everything that bounced beneath it. The woman opened the door. A black dude dressed as a pizza delivery guy stood there, already making bedroom eyes at her. "Did someone order a big Italian sausage?" the man asked. "I never thought that line made sense," Ricky murmured. "He's obviously not—" "Shut up," Omar hissed. He never tolerated talking during movies. "Oh no," the woman deadpanned. "I don't have any cash and can't find my checkbook." "Lady," the delivery guy replied, "if I don't get something in return for this pizza, my boss is going to fire me." The solution they came up with was painfully obvious. Omar didn't care about any of that. The man was invited in, they made out briefly, and then, holy fucking shit. Their clothes were tossed aside, the camera zooming in on all the details he normally only fantasized about when locked in his bedroom late at night. Speaking of which, as the scene continued, he had to continually resist the urge to adjust himself, which was becoming a real pain, both figuratively and literally. Ricky seemed to notice him squirming and said, "I usually jack off while watching these." That was Omar's favorite hobby. He practiced often enough to be a pro, but he'd never admit that to another guy. He was willing to now, if it let him do what he wanted. "Let's take turns," he said. "Wait outside, I want to go first." "I'm not going to leave you alone in my parents' bedroom," Ricky said. Then he moved his hand to the button of his shorts, like he was about to undo them. "I promise not to look." Omar hesitated before his gaze flicked back to the screen. When would he get another chance like this? Rational thought was shoved aside by raging demands of his hormones as he scrambled to get his jeans open, eager for the familiar pleasure of his right hand. A group of LGBT teenagers try to survive the early 90s while searching for love in Pride High. Available as an audiobook, ebook, or paperback at your favorite retailer.